in God if society didn't force you to?
It's an interesting way to put the question. If society didn't force me, would I believe in God? There's many ways to answer that question. I personally don't feel society made me believe in God, for one. And I don't necessarily see my view as belief. As a philosopher, I tend to seek knowledge. So I'm trying to go beyond belief in a sense. But there's a point that you're making that's interesting and true, and that's that, whether you're a Christian or Muslim or Buddhist, often depends on what society or culture you were born into. So that is relevant in that most of us are influenced by our culture. But personally, I was never very inclined to believe because of my culture, and maybe that had to do with my own upbringing. My parents were never very dogmatic, right? I was born into Catholicism, Christianity, but we just kind of went to church randomly or whatever, so I didn't really feel forced to believe. And so most of how I think of God has come through my own search. So I don't believe in believing in God just because others do. Right? I think we all should go on our own spiritual journey and seeking, right? So for me, religion, and perhaps this goes to your other question, right? And religion and spirituality in the way that I approach it, and I think should be approached, is not opposed to science, right? Because if we think about it, at least depending on what tradition you're talking about, whether it's East or West, it can differ, but the goal generally of religion and science could be seen as the truth. So if we're looking for the ultimate truth, should we disagree? Whether you call yourself a scientist or a religious person or a spiritual person, if we're both looking for the same gold, it doesn't matter if you're using, a shovel or some other tool and so forth. So I think it's an issue or a question of the tool or approach. So it's perhaps could be seen as a different angle or approach to the same question or reality. So for me, God and the discoveries of science are not in conflict. They should go together because they're both about reality and truth. If God is real, it should not contradict with the reality because God is real as well, right? Part of reality. And depending on how you conceive of God as well, it can play a different role in a sense in terms of how we view science, how we implement our belief in God or the God relationship in the world can kind of be somewhat different. But in terms of conflict, I don't see a conflict. If anything, if we look at the tradition of philosophers as well, it could be argued that science actually comes out of theism, right? And it may help us understand science better. The birth of science was from many theists, right? Descartes believed in God, and some people say that, even Newton also believed in God, and that without the presupposition of God, he would not have thought of his scientific theories. In other words, the concept of God that they were working with helped them come up with the science because they're presupposing certain things about the nature of reality because they believed in God. In other words, if God, being the source of the universe, is intelligent and logical, then that's why you would presuppose and assume that the world itself will be logical and rational, because the source, i.e. God, is rational and orderly, right? Hence, they made those assumptions and predicted things based on the presupposed order of the universe, which they only presuppose because they presuppose God. See? So it's not in conflict.
We have established that they are in conflict. Now, my another question to you is, if we manage to disprove the existence of God, what do we do with religion then?
Well, the quick answer would be, like we talked about earlier, like Miguel de Unamuno saying, well, it can still be useful if someone comes to think. I don't think we could ever disprove God, but if someone comes to think that God has been disproven, or they don't believe for whatever reason, it can still be useful in practical ways, right? Both psychologically to help others, or to be motivated in a certain kind of way, right? To be a good person, to give morals, and so forth. So the notion of God can help us live our lives, and that's been traditionally what religion tends to do. It gives our lives actual order, purpose sometimes. So I don't think it would ever be useless per se. But I think the way you posed the question at another point was more interesting, right? Because I sort of quickly said, like, oh, well, I don't think God can be disproven. It might be a question whether God can be proven as well, right? So those are two different approaches, whether God can be disproven or whether God can be proven. It might be that neither is the case. You can't disprove or prove. So if you put it that way, the question of, is it possible? The reason why some people might think that in the future, theoretically, right, could we disprove God by the method of science that you suggest of, well, can we reach a point where we look at the physical universe as explained through like mechanical, scientific laws, and therefore there's no room for God if you've like discovered all the laws of the universe and sort of predicted everything and how everything is interconnected, and so we have like a full picture of the universe. Therefore, is there no space for God if we've gotten like this materialistic kind of full description of the universe and reality? And my answer is twofold. One, worst case scenario, so to speak, if the world were fully sort of described in that way, some people might say, and I'm sympathetic to this view, that still doesn't disprove God, because you can think of God differently and say, well, God is the universe. It's a kind of pantheistic notion, where we equate the notion of God as the universe, and therefore God is all that infinite complexity that we're describing. Well, if you fully describe it, then it's not infinite. So that's another side note. But assuming that we were to give this full description in a physicalistic kind of scientific way, right, where we objectify the world and fully describe it, someone might still say, the way the universe works, i.e. it seems to have some kind of order and intelligence, that combination of the world just existing and so forth, and existing in a certain kind of way, well, we call that God, right? That's Spinoza's God, right? Spinozistic philosophy, right? So philosophy, he equated nature / reality with God. Now, what's interesting with Spinoza, that kind of opens up a whole nother worm, a kind of worms, as they say, is that he admits that there's extension and non-extension in reality, like thought, and they're like two sides of the same coin, right? The sort of seen physical universe, and then the non-physical aspect of reality, the realm of thought, right? And Plato calls the world the forms, the intelligible world, and so forth, the realm of knowledge, a kind of metaphysical world. So if we start to postulate that, then that gives the answer to what I said before, that perhaps we could never fully describe the world, because when you think of describing the world scientifically, you're already presupposing objects, materially extended objects in physical space, and only that can be like fully described. But when you go to an inner world, if there's a non-physical aspect to reality that's like mental, non-physical, consciousness, show me consciousness, and then describe it, right? So if consciousness or mind is not physical, you could never fully describe. And I think that reality is such, meaning there are non-physical aspects to reality, and therefore it will never be fully described. And my concept of God, by the way, is more tied to consciousness itself. Therefore, that's also why God can never be disproven, maybe never fully proven in the objective scientific sense, but God can be known through consciousness, because God is consciousness for me. It's kind of a Hinduistic, Advaita Vedantic philosophy, right? But bare minimum for me, if God is God, God is conscious, and or consciousness, and the source of all consciousness, right? And so from there, you can come up with different kinds of philosophies or theories that may or may not connect with other religions and so forth, but it is a kind of Hinduistic notion of God, right? Some traditions of Hinduism talk about God as pure consciousness, pure being, which means existence itself, eternal, right? Always existing. God cannot not be, right? God is being itself. So pure consciousness, pure being, pure bliss. That's the essence of God, the nature of God for some Hindu traditions, with which I kind of subscribe to and like that kind of depiction of God as kind of like the bare minimum notion of God that I think is undeniable. Then we can sort of debate other possibilities of how God could manifest and so forth, or what's up with all these different religions and how they talk about God. That's a whole nother conversation. But I think the God that's indisputable for me is God as pure consciousness, and that cannot be disproven. Maybe not proven scientifically, but I think it can be known by different methods. That's why people talk about yoga, meditation, or as a prayer and so forth. That's the original goal of yoga. It was invented for knowledge of God, for knowledge of self and knowledge of God, or the ultimate reality. The meaning of yoga actually means union of the self with God, or to realize that union, which some Hindus call Atman. The self is Brahman, right? The self is Brahman. Now, important side note, because some people get really offended at this. If they're more traditional theists, that might sound very blasphemous. Like, are you saying that you are God, or like the self is God? Yes and no. When Hindus say this, or the Advaita Vedantic non-dualist tradition say this, their words don't mean that, right? Not the blasphemous notion of you are God. It's more like your deepest essence, which they call the true self. That's one with God, not your mind and your ego and your finite self that calls himself John or whoever, right? That's not obviously God. But the consciousness that allows you to say, I am John, that awareness is connected to God. You cannot be conscious without God. So that essence of you, that deeper essence of the self of a person, that's the true self in Advaita Vedanta, right? And that's what they mean by Atman is Brahman, right? So it's not that blasphemous as it seems at first, but it's a beautiful philosophy and a good foundation, I think, for religiousness and spirituality. That's kind of what brought me back to spirituality and religion when I read texts like that, because I went through a phase of just like agnosticism, even unwilling atheism, because I wanted to believe, but I didn't have proof actually when I was younger, and so I needed to find my way back to religion and spirituality through studying Buddhism and Hindu. So they had this more direct experience approach, and more philosophical. And so when I discovered Advaita Vedanta, this kind of non-dualist notion of God, and experiential based, right? That knowledge you have to go and discover, that was attractive to me. And so that's why I might have said something like, I don't conceive my belief in God as belief. The reason is because I tried to base what I claim to be true, i.e. my so-called beliefs, based on experience that I think gives me knowledge of that. I have the experience that I'm here. That's enough for me to say I know. I don't need to prove it to you, right? That I'm sort of existing is something I don't need to prove. I know by my own existence, right? Myself. I don't need to give you some logical argument. So that's kind of how I arrive at my faith in God, so to speak. It's more through practices that gave me certain experiences that support the belief claims. So when we make certain statements, right, like, oh, I believe that God exists, when I make that statement, those are words, but the words are pointing to something that I think is actually true, i.e., that I know to be true. So I'm more inclined to say what I believe is that I know God, actually. Now, the details of the fullness of the nature of God, I'm not sure yet. I'm still exploring that, right, as a philosopher. But that there's something that's the foundation of all existence and awareness, like our mind. To me, that's undeniable, and that's God, right? Like, or else we wouldn't be having this conversation. To me, God is what allows things to be, period. Especially consciousness, especially awareness. So to me, that's how I arrived after my periods of doubt. That's how I came back to so-called belief in God through actually this tradition in Hinduism that suggests that you can have kind of direct knowledge of God. That was a very roundabout way to answer the question, but so yeah, I don't think God can be disproved.